Good morning. Good morning. That was nice. That was nice, thank you. So as most of you know, I'm a father of 3. So as a parent, how many other parents are that get millions and millions of things with a picture of Noah's Ark on it? Quilts, we got quilts upon quilts with this, some version of this. You know, the happy little creatures, 2x2, and they keep in a boat with a nice pretty rainbow, right? We got all those things. All those animals are smiling. We say, oh, it just warms my heart so much. It's so cute, the little baby. We like this little baby. Did you get Noah's Ark stuff? Yeah. And then we put like the animals 2x2 in a little mobile that spins around the crib. We had one of those too. All this around this story where God calls humanity this dark cesspool of violence, and that's the biblical story that we have for our kids. How does that happen? How does that become the biblical story that we match up with our kids? Actually, I think it's pretty easy to explain, right? We like to sugarcoat things. So we take those things that are dark and kind of call us out, and then we sugarcoat them and make them nice, happy things. Like, you know, cute little animals on a boat with a cute little rainbow. So it makes us feel good, right? Well, let's take a look back at the first chapter of Genesis. The first chapter of Genesis, what happens in the first chapter of Genesis? Are we sure? Okay. Yeah, we did. Like, you can confidently say creation. So the first chapter of Genesis is a story of God's creation. And on the first day, God does this, and then he says, and it is good. Second day, and it is good. Third day, and it is good. So at the end of each day of God's work, God says, it is good. It is good. Take a couple of seconds and think about a project or something new you were trying or something new you were working on. Maybe it was a piece of music. Maybe it was a new recipe you were trying. Maybe it was a home improvement project, some gardening. Like, man, I am so excited. This is going to be great. Got that thing in your head? And then it stinks. It just stinks. So I like to experiment making chili. So I'm like, I'm going to put some of this in. I'm going to put some of that in. And, oh man, I'm so excited. This is going to be so good. And then I tasted it. And it went in the garbage because it was awful. So that's God's creation story, right? Like multiplied by a lot. That's God's creation story. So disappointed by the outcome. But it was good. And then it wasn't. And then it wasn't. And God grieved. God grieved the sinful humanity and the part that we played in creation and the violence and the destruction. God grieved. So God decided, I'm trashing it. I want to start all over. Much like my chili. I want to start all over. And I'm going to flood the earth. But then God remembered, it was good. It was good. was good. So Noah builds this ark and gathers 2 by 2 everything and stuffs it on a boat. That's not a pretty picture. That's not a pretty picture. But Noah puts all these things in the boat as God commanded. Because God wanted to wipe out everything and start over. And then he realized, through that anger, through that frustration, through that despair, God remembered that it was good. God's faithfulness and God's mercy at the last second barely went out. So instead of wiping out everything and starting from scratch, because let's face it, if God wanted to wipe out everything and start over from scratch, it could have happened. But God, it was good. God barely remembered. Just barely. But barely is enough, right? Barely is enough, right? I mean, if you make that fist, but don't throw the punch. If those words, if those hurtful words are on the tip of your tongue, I know you know what I'm talking about. If those words are on the tip of your tongue, but they don't leave your lips, if that finger on the trigger doesn't actually pull it, barely is enough. Barely is enough. Barely still matters. You see, life is so fleeting, life is so fragile, that barely is enough. Without barely, destruction still exists. Without barely, devastation still exists. But God grieved the violence. God grieved the injustice of humanity. So God said, I'm going to hang a bow in the sky. I got some bad news for you. There was no word for rainbow. There was no word for rainbow. That's part of, I think that's part of us sugarcoating things. Oh, well, it's so cute to have this little baby thing with a rainbow instead of a bow, right? You know what bow I'm talking about. The bow of war, the bow of destruction. Yeah. That's actually what God was hanging in the sky, but you can't put that on kids' clothes, right? Because you're not going to buy those. You're not going to have your kid with a nice little Noah's Ark shirt and a bow and arrow at the top. But you'll buy the one with a rainbow because that looks good. But so God hangs this bow of destruction in the sky. Why? It's not for us to remember. Did you catch that in the reading? I know it was a long reading. Did you catch that in the reading? That bow is in the sky so God remembers. Not so we can look at it and remember, but God does that for God. Not for us. Now fast forward to today. Humanity was so moved by God's promise that there's no more sin, and there's no more violence, and there's no more destruction. Right? We were so moved by God's promise, so moved by that bow or rainbow, whatever you want to make it be, that we no longer sin and there's no more violence, right? Yeah. Sin's still prevalent. We still rebel against God. We still don't follow the commandments. Violence is rampant. And another news flash here, we as Christians aren't exempt from being victims or perpetrators. Unfortunately, all this time has passed. And humanity really, at our core, humanity hasn't changed that much. My guess is God still grieves that. That's why we need that reminder. That's why God needs that reminder. Now, after the flood, this wasn't part of it. After the flood, this wind comes across and dries up the waters, right? The waters recede, and this wind comes and dries up the waters. The ruah. It's the same word for wind and spirit. Also in Genesis 1, the wind moved over the waters and put order into chaos. Ruah. The Spirit of God, this breath of life, was there at the very beginning of creation. This wind, this Spirit was there at the very beginning of creation. This breath of God gave life after the flood. After the flood, sin, corruption, our shortcomings as humanity still existed. But again, the breath, the Spirit of God, entered into the waters of the womb of Mary and gave us Christ. The breath of God, the Spirit of God, came again into the waters of the Jordan River and baptized Jesus. The breath of God moved over the waters in baptism when we baptize. That same Spirit of God, that same breath of God exists in each and every one of us. Because you are God's creation. You are God's creation. Not perfect. Not without sin. But you and me, we're filled with the breath of life. We're filled with the breath of God. And God, rather than destroy the earth, rather than flood the earth with destruction, floods us with mercy and floods us with grace. And my God, that we needed. That was God's promise. We're a broken world. We're a world in need of justice. We're a world in need of redeeming. But we're filled with the breath of God, the very breath that creates life, the breath that gives the redemption that we so desperately need. Sometimes it's hard to imagine that not just ourselves, but the person across from us is also created by God. They too breathe in the breath of God. Take a deep breath with me. Breathing in the breath of God. I think that's why taking a deep breath in your moments of anger, your moments of anxiety, can be so powerful. Just take a deep breath. Breathe in the breath of God. Know that you are redeemed, and you are forgiven, and you are loved. Amen.